Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On a crisp autumn morning in 1854, the residents of Forsyth Park in Savannah awoke to find something unusual tied to the wrought iron fence surrounding the newly constructed fountain. A small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and warped by moisture, contained handwritten entries spanning nearly 2 years. The first page bore only a name, Clara. No investigators were called. No reports were filed. The book disappeared into the pocket of a groundskeeper who later claimed he had found nothing that morning. But by then, word had already spread through the quarters behind the grand homes on Drayton Street. Something had been found, something that wasn't meant to be read. In 1868, during the reconstruction of a historic mansion on Abercorn Street, workers renovating the attic space discovered a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a sealed tin box containing what appeared to be a journal, several folded papers, and a small cloth pouch containing human hair. The contractor, a northern man with no ties to the previous owners, turned these items over to a local historian who catalogued them before they were transferred to Savannah's municipal archives. The documents remained there, untouched, until a graduate student from Emory University requested access in 1965. 3 weeks after beginning his research, the student abandoned his thesis and returned to his family home in Massachusetts. The collection was subsequently misplaced during a reorganization of the archive. What follows is an account pieced together from these documents, newspaper clippings, property records, and the fragmented recollections of those who claimed to know the truth. The Forsyth household stood 3 stories tall on the eastern side of Savannah's historic district, its white columns and wraparound porches establishing it as one of the finest homes in the city. William Forsyth had made his fortune in shipping and cotton, owning 3 vessels that regularly traveled between Savannah and Liverpool. His wife, Margaret, was known for her garden parties and charitable work with the Episcopal Church. They had 2 daughters, Emily, aged 22, and Sarah, aged 19. The household staff included a cook, 2 house servants, a groundskeeper, and a coachman, all enslaved individuals whose names appear only in property ledgers and bills of sale. In the spring of 1853, William Forsyth returned from a business trip to Charleston with a new addition to the household, a young woman named Clara. According to the bill of sale preserved in county records, she was purchased from the Mayfield plantation outside Charleston for a sum considerably higher than market value. The document listed her age as 20 years old, her skills as reading, fine needlework, and household management, and her disposition as quiet, well-mannered, with no history of resistance. What the document failed to mention, but what neighbors and visitors would later recall in hushed conversations, was her appearance. Clara Mayfield, as she was known by her previous owner's name, possessed what multiple accounts described as an unsettling beauty. Parish records from St. John's Episcopal Church note the rector's wife commenting that it was inappropriate for such a creature to be present during services, despite the fact that Clara sat in the segregated gallery with other enslaved persons. The daughter of a visiting cotton broker wrote in her diary that during a dinner at the Forsyth home, she noticed how Mother kept adjusting her posture to block Father's view of the girl serving behind her. For the first 3 months following her arrival, Clara worked alongside the other household staff, primarily assisting with the daughters' wardrobes and serving at formal dinners. Neighbours reported seeing her accompanying Mrs. Forsyth and her daughters on shopping excursions, carrying packages and holding parasols. Then, suddenly, she vanished from public view. When questioned by her friends during a sewing circle, Margaret Forsyth explained that Clara had been reassigned to upstairs duties and would no longer be serving at social functions. The cook, in testimony given years later to a Freedmen's Bureau official, recalled that around this same time, Mr. Forsyth had the attic space renovated, adding a separate staircase accessible only through his study. The household ledger shows payments to a carpenter for special modifications to the third floor, and the purchase of one secure door with iron fittings. Sarah Forsyth's personal diary, recovered from the tin box found beneath the attic floorboards, contains a curious entry dated July 18, 1853. Mother has taken to her bed again with her headaches. Father says it is the heat, but I know better. It began after she found him in Clara's quarters late at night. Now he has moved Clara upstairs where Mother cannot go because of her weak heart. The stairs are too steep, he says, but I have seen him climb them 3 times today. The following weeks show increasing tension in the household. The cook testified that food was to be left outside the attic door at specific times. No one was permitted to enter except Mr. Forsyth. When Emily Forsyth became engaged that September to the son of another prominent Savannah family, preparations for the wedding consumed the household's attention. Sarah's diary mentions Clara only once during this period. I heard sounds from above last night, not footsteps, but something being dragged across the floor. Then crying. I asked Father at breakfast if Clara was ill. He said I was imagining things, and that I should never mention her name at the table again. The wedding took place in November of 1853. Photographs preserved in the Savannah Historical Society show the Forsyth family, William, Margaret, Emily in her bridal gown, and Sarah as maid of honor, standing on the front steps of Christ Church. Their faces are solemn, as was the custom for photographs of that era. Behind them, barely visible in the doorway, stands a house servant. The cook's testimony identifies this person as Bessie, who had replaced Clara as the family's main house servant. In December, Margaret Forsyth traveled to Charleston to visit her sister, taking Sarah with her. According to ship manifests, they remained there for 6 weeks. William Forsyth stayed behind, citing business matters that required his attention. It was during this period that the first documented evidence of what was happening in the attic emerges. A ledger from Forsyth Shipping Office, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society collection, contains a peculiar entry on its back pages. Written in what handwriting experts have confirmed as William Forsyth's hand is a series of dates and notations. Deck 14, refused food. Deck 15, still refused, administered discipline. Deck 16, accepted water only. Deck 17, full compliance restored. Similar entries continue through January. When Margaret and Sarah returned in February of 1854, neighbors reported that William seemed transformed, irritable, distracted, often leaving the house before dawn and returning late at night. The cook recalled that he now took all his meals in his study and required a bottle of whiskey to be left outside the attic door each evening, alongside Clara's food tray. Sarah's diary entries from this period reveal her growing concern. Father looks through us at dinner, as if we are not there. Mother pretends not to notice, but I have heard her crying at night. Twice now I have seen scratches on Father's face, which he attributes to his new hunting dog, but the dog is kept in the carriage house, and the scratches appear after he spends the night in his study, which adjoins the new staircase. In March of 1854, William Forsyth purchased additional iron fittings from a blacksmith shop on Bay Street. The receipt, preserved in business records, indicates these were for window securities and restraints. That same month, Sarah's diary records that she had begun to hear singing from the attic. Hymns mostly, but sometimes strange melodies I do not recognize. The voice is Clara's, but changed somehow, harsher. When I mentioned the singing to Bessie, she crossed herself and would not speak of it. April brought two significant events to the Forsyth household. First, Sarah became engaged to a young lawyer from a respectable but not wealthy Savannah family. William Forsyth opposed the match vehemently, threatening to disinherit her. Second, Margaret Forsyth fell ill with what the family physician diagnosed as nervous exhaustion. She was prescribed bed rest and laudanum, which kept her sedated most days. With her mother incapacitated and her father increasingly absent from family life, Sarah took over management of the household. Her diary indicates that she instructed Bessie to leave additional food on Clara's tray, fruit and sweetbreads that might bring her comfort. She also records her attempts to access the attic. I tried Father's study door today while he was at his office, but found it locked. I pressed my ear to the door that I believe leads to the attic stairs and called Clara's name. There was a sound like fingernails on wood, then silence. The ledger entries in William's hand become increasingly erratic during this period. April 23rd. Behavior improved after correction. April 25. Found implement hidden in bedding. Removed all comforts as punishment. April 30th. Attempted to speak to me of outside. Reminded her of her place. May 4th. Compliance achieved through usual methods. On May 10th, 1854, a fire broke out in the kitchen of the Forsyth home. According to newspaper accounts, the cook had left a pot unattended while assisting with laundry. The fire was contained before it could spread beyond the kitchen and rear parlor, but the smoke damaged portions of the main house. Insurance records indicate that all members of the household were safely evacuated, including Margaret Forsyth, who was carried from her bedroom by the coachman. What the newspapers failed to report, but what Sarah's diary reveals, is that during the confusion of the fire, she took the key to her father's study from his waistcoat while he directed the fire brigade in the yard. "I had perhaps 5 minutes," she wrote. "The study door opened easily. The second door, the one leading upstairs, required 2 keys, one for the lock, another for a bolt. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped them. The smell that came down those stairs, unwashed bodies, waste, something sickly sweet like rotting flowers. I called her name as I climbed. There was no answer." Sarah's description of what she found in the attic occupies 4 pages of her diary, the handwriting becoming increasingly disordered as the account progresses. She describes a space divided into 2 rooms. The first contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair bolted to the floor. The second, accessible through a door that could only be locked from the outside, was empty except for iron rings set into the wall at various heights. "The Clara I found was not the Clara who had arrived in our home," Sarah wrote. "Her hair had been roughly cut close to her scalp. Her arms bore marks of restraint. When she saw me, she pressed herself against the far wall and began reciting what sounded like Bible verses, though the words were wrong, corrupted somehow. I told her about the fire, that we had to leave. She laughed, a sound that made my blood freeze, and asked if I'd been sent to test her again. When I reached for her hand, she flinched as if expecting a blow." Sarah's attempt to lead Clara from the attic was interrupted by the sound of William Forsyth's voice calling from below. Her diary recounts, "I begged her to come with me, promised to hide her somewhere safe, but she shook her head. 'There is nowhere he will not find me,' she said, 'and then it will be worse for us both.' I knew she spoke the truth. I had only one thing of value on my person, the cameo brooch Mother had given me for my birthday. I pressed it into her hand and told her I would find a way to help her. The look she gave me contained no hope. Sarah was forced to leave Clara in the attic and return the keys to her father's waistcoat before he noticed their absence. That night, she reports hearing William Forsyth's footsteps on the attic stairs, followed by sounds no decent person should describe. She made a decision then, her diary indicates, to seek help from her fiancé, Thomas Harper. Thomas Harper appears in Savannah's records as a junior partner in a law firm specializing in shipping contracts and estate planning. His correspondence with Sarah, preserved in the tin box, reveals a man genuinely concerned about her reports, but hesitant to directly challenge someone of William Forsyth's standing. "The law provides certain rights to property owners," he wrote, using deliberately vague language, "but there are limits to what civilized society can countenance. If what you describe is accurate, intervention may be justified. However, we must proceed with extreme caution." Throughout late May and early June, Sarah and Thomas exchanged letters discussing various approaches to Clara's situation. Thomas made discreet inquiries about legal precedents involving the treatment of enslaved persons, finding that while there were laws against excessive cruelty, they were rarely enforced when the accused was a wealthy white man. Meanwhile, William Forsyth's behavior grew increasingly erratic. The household accounts show large purchases of alcohol, and Sarah's diary describes him as perpetually in a state between rage and collapse. On June 12, 1854, Margaret Forsyth died unexpectedly. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but rumors circulated that she had taken an excessive dose of her laudanum, whether intentionally or by accident. Sarah's diary entry from that day is brief. "Mother is gone. Father locked himself in his study when the doctor confirmed it. I heard him climbing the stairs soon after. His grief takes a form I cannot bear to contemplate." The weeks following Margaret's funeral were marked by increased instability in the Forsyth home. William disappeared for days at a time, returning disheveled and reeking of alcohol. Sarah noted that during his absences, she left food outside the attic door, but often found it untouched. "I have called to her through the door," she wrote, "but there is never any response. Sometimes I think I hear movement inside, a scraping against the floor, but it may be rats in the walls." In early July, William Forsyth announced that he was traveling to New York on business and would be gone for at least 2 weeks. The day after his departure, Sarah and Thomas Harper, accompanied by a locksmith who had been sworn to secrecy, entered the house with the intention of freeing Clara. Sarah's diary and Thomas's subsequent statement to the Freedmen's Bureau describe what they found. The attic rooms were empty, the bed had been stripped, the washstand overturned. A thorough search revealed bloodstains on the floorboards and walls, which someone had attempted to clean. In the smaller room, one of the iron rings had been pulled partially from the wall, splintering the wood around it. Most disturbing was the discovery of a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard, containing the tin box that would eventually be rediscovered in 1868. Inside was Clara's journal. The journal, written on paper Thomas had determined was taken from William Forsyth's shipping ledgers, chronicles Clara's time in the attic from her perspective. The handwriting begins as educated and precise, but deteriorates over time. Early entries describe William Forsyth's escalating demands and Clara's attempts to placate him while maintaining her dignity. She writes of singing to herself when alone, of counting the nails in the floorboards, of creating elaborate stories in her mind about the people passing on the street below her tiny window. As the journal progresses, the entries become more disjointed. Clara describes conversations with people who aren't there, visions of her mother who had died years earlier on the Mayfield plantation, and increasingly detailed plans for escape. The final entries, dated approximately 2 weeks before Sarah and Thomas's discovery of the empty rooms, contain a chilling resolution. "He believes I am broken. Clara wrote, and so I have allowed myself to appear broken. I have studied his habits, his weaknesses. The door has 2 locks, but the window has only iron bars. He does not know that I have been working at them each night. Using the edge of the chamber pot, I deliberately cracked against the wall months ago. 1 bar is now loose enough. I am so thin now I believe I can fit through. It is 3 stories to the ground, but there is an oak tree whose branches reach within a few feet of this window. I have measured the distance with my eye 1,000 times. Tomorrow night he leaves for his club. I will wait until the house is quiet, then make my attempt. If I succeed, I will find a way north. If I fail and survive, I will find another way out that cannot be blocked by bars or doors. He will never cage me again. No record exists of what became of Clara Mayfield after that night. No body was ever found on the Forsyth property. No reports of an injured or deceased young woman appear in Savannah's records from that period. The groundskeeper, who later claimed to have found the leather book by Forsyth Park Fountain in October 1854, described its contents as the ravings of someone who had lost their mind to fear, but could recall no specific details about what it contained. William Forsyth returned from his New York trip to find his daughter had moved out of the family home and into her fiancé's mother's house. An unprecedented breach of social protocol that caused significant gossip. When he threatened to disinherit her, Thomas Harper reportedly produced copies of Clara's journal and informed Forsyth that while they had no intention of making the matter public, the documents would be preserved as insurance against any retaliation. The marriage took place in September, with William Forsyth notably absent from the ceremony. By December of 1854, William Forsyth had sold his Savannah home and relocated to New Orleans, where he died in 1859 of what his death certificate lists as complications of alcoholism. The house on Abercorn Street passed through several owners before being purchased by a northern family after the Civil War. It was during their renovation that the tin box was discovered. Sarah and Thomas Harper remained in Savannah throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction. Thomas's law practice eventually specialized in cases involving the rights of formerly enslaved persons. Sarah became known for her work establishing schools for freed children. Neither ever spoke publicly about Clara Mayfield or the events at the Forsyth home, but their private correspondence reveals that they continued to search for information about her fate for many years. In 1862, Thomas received a letter from an abolitionist contact in Philadelphia describing an encounter with a woman who claimed to have escaped from Savannah by climbing from an attic window and making her way north via the Underground Railroad. The woman, who called herself Only Mercy, bore scars on her wrists and ankles consistent with prolonged restraint. When asked about her former life, she would only say, "That woman is dead. I watched her fall from a window and shatter on the ground below. I am someone new now." Thomas forwarded this letter to Sarah with a note. Could it be her? I cannot say with certainty, but I find myself hoping so. The Savannah Historical Society maintains that the story of Clara Mayfield is most likely a composite of several actual events, embellished over time as it was retold. No definitive proof exists that a young woman was imprisoned in the attic of the Forsyth home. The tin box and its contents, including Clara's journal and Sarah's diary, were catalogued in 1965, but reported missing during an inventory conducted the following year. The graduate student who abandoned his research never published his findings and refused all requests for interviews until his death in 1987. Yet visitors to the house on Abercorn Street, now divided into apartments, occasionally report unusual phenomena. The sound of soft singing from the third floor when no one is there, the sensation of being watched while climbing the stairs, the lingering scent of flowers in rooms where none are present. Current residents have learned not to mention these experiences to prospective tenants. In the small cemetery behind St. John's Episcopal Church, there is a marker placed in 1879 that bears no name, only the inscription, "She found her freedom." Local tour guides will tell you the grave belongs to a young woman who died tragically in one of Savannah's grand homes. They describe her as beautiful, educated, and ultimately doomed by those very qualities. Whether this marker has any connection to Clara Mayfield remains a matter of speculation, another whispered story in a city built on secrets buried just beneath its elegant surface. To this day, some claim that if you stand beneath the oak trees near the former Forsyth property on a quiet night, you might hear a soft voice singing hymns from somewhere above, altered hymns, with words changed to speak not of heavenly salvation, but of earthly escape. Others insist the singing is just the wind in the Spanish moss, a natural phenomenon given supernatural significance by those who know the house's history. But even these skeptics tend to quicken their pace as they pass by, their eyes fixed firmly ahead, refusing to look up at the small attic window where a desperate young woman might once have stood, measuring the distance to the ground, calculating the risk of falling against the certainty of remaining caged. The leather-bound book that started this investigation was allegedly seen again in 1932, in the possession of a private collector who specialized in artifacts related to Southern history. When approached by a researcher from Emory University, the collector denied having such an item. After his death in 1958, his collection was donated to various institutions, but no catalogue ever listed a journal matching the description of the one found at Forsyth Park. Like Clara herself, it has vanished into history, present in memory and story, but always just beyond the reach of definitive proof. As for the oak tree that may have facilitated Clara's escape, it was removed in 1943 after being damaged in a storm. The workman who cut it down reported finding, embedded deep within the trunk, a small cameo brooch of the type fashionable in the 1850s. This artifact was turned over to the Historical Society, but subsequently disappeared from their collection during the same reorganization that claimed the tin box and its contents. The truth about Clara Mayfield, who she was, what she endured, and how her story ended, remains elusive, preserved only in fragments of documents, whispered rumors, and the persistent feeling reported by those who visit the house that someone is watching from the attic window, still waiting for the right moment to attempt an impossible escape across a dangerous gap, choosing the risk of destruction over the certainty of continued confinement. In that choice, perhaps, lies the most enduring horror of her story, not what was done to her, but what she was driven to contemplate doing to herself. Some of Savannah's oldest families still refuse to discuss the Forsyth name or acknowledge any connection to William Forsyth in their genealogies. The location where his home once stood is now marked only by a magnolia tree, planted, according to local tradition, to cover ground where no grass would grow. Tour guides point it out as they lead visitors through the historic district, attributing its placement to various legends and superstitions. None mention Clara Mayfield or the attic room. Some stories, it seems, remain too disquieting to retell, even in a city that profits from its haunted history. In the municipal archives, where the graduate student conducted his ill-fated research in 1965, there is now a gap in the catalogue where the Forsyth family records should be. When asked about this discrepancy, archivists explained that some materials were damaged by flooding in the 1970s and had to be discarded. Whether this explanation represents bureaucratic truth or institutional forgetting is a matter of speculation. What remains clear is that the story of Clara Mayfield, the most beautiful slave who was imprisoned in the attic, continues to exist in the margins of Savannah's history, neither fully documented nor completely erased, a persistent whisper that refuses to be silenced. Perhaps that persistence is itself a kind of justice, ensuring that what happened in that attic room is not entirely lost to time. Or perhaps, as Sarah Harper wrote in a letter to her husband near the end of her life, some horrors should be remembered, not to satisfy our morbid curiosity, but to remind us of what humans are capable of inflicting on one another, and what we must vigilantly guard against in ourselves and our society. If Clara's story serves that purpose, then her suffering may yet yield something of value. As you walk the streets of Savannah today, look up at the attic windows of the grand old homes. Most are empty now or used for storage. But one, they say, still shows a light on certain nights when the rest of the house is dark. Not electric light, but the wavering glow of a candle moving slowly back and forth, as if someone is keeping watch, waiting for the household to fall silent, so they can make their attempt at freedom over a century and a half after Clara Mayfield may have made hers. Historians examining this case in the modern era have pointed to several inconsistencies that raise questions about the narrative's authenticity. The Emory University archives contain a letter dated 1967 from the graduate student who abandoned his thesis, addressed to his former advisor. In it he claims that during his research he was approached by an elderly woman who identified herself only as a descendant of the Harper family. She warned him to abandon his project, stating that some stories are best left undisturbed. When he persisted, asking for specific information about Clara Mayfield, the woman reportedly said, "There was no Clara. There were many Claras. The name was changed to protect not the guilty, but those who came after." This cryptic statement aligns with census records from 1850 that show at least 17 enslaved women named Clara in Chatham County alone. The practice of using a single name for multiple individuals was not uncommon, making it difficult for historians to trace specific people through official documents. Whether Clara Mayfield was one woman or a composite of several remains uncertain. In 1972, during renovation of another historic Savannah home less than a mile from the former Forsyth property, workers discovered a small space behind a false wall in the attic. Inside was a collection of personal items, a hairbrush containing strands of dark hair, a torn piece of calico fabric, and a small book of hymns with certain verses altered in handwriting, different from the marginalia elsewhere in the text. The most striking modification appeared next to the hymn Amazing Grace, where the line, "I once was lost, but now am found," had been changed to "I once was found, but now am lost." The homeowners, disturbed by the discovery, requested that no further investigation be conducted. The items were resealed within the wall, where they presumably remain to this day. The following year, a doctoral student at Howard University uncovered shipping records indicating that William Forsyth's business trips to Charleston often coincided with slave auctions specializing in what were euphemistically called fancy girls, young enslaved women sold primarily for sexual exploitation rather than labor. These records show that between 1850 and 1854, Forsyth made at least 6 such trips, returning to Savannah afterward. Property records, however, only document the purchase of one enslaved person, Clara, during this period. What became of any others he may have acquired remains unrecorded. Parish records from St. John's Episcopal Church reveal another curious detail. In December 1854, 2 months after William Forsyth relocated to New Orleans, Thomas Harper paid for a series of special prayers for the soul of one departed under uncertain circumstances. The church registry does not name the subject of these prayers, listing them only as a woman known to God. This timing corresponds to Sarah Harper's last diary entry regarding Clara, in which she writes, "Thomas believes we should accept that she is gone, whether to freedom or to God's embrace. I cannot do so without some ritual of remembrance, some acknowledgement that she existed and suffered in this world. If we allow her to vanish without trace, we become complicit in her erasure. The oral history tradition among Savannah's African-American community contains numerous stories about a woman who escaped captivity by flying from an attic window. These accounts, collected by folklore researchers in the 1970s, describe a woman so determined to be free that she transformed into a bird, or, in some versions, was carried away by birds rather than remain imprisoned. Scholars note that such transformation narratives often served as metaphorical retellings of actual escapes, with flight representing both literal and spiritual freedom. Whether these stories bear any connection to Clara Mayfield is impossible to determine with certainty, though the thematic parallels are striking. In 1880, Sarah Harper established a small charitable foundation dedicated to supporting educational opportunities for young women of color. The foundation's charter document, preserved in county records, contains a dedication to the memory of one whose name cannot be spoken, whose suffering cannot be measured, and whose courage cannot be forgotten. The Harper Educational Trust continued this work until 1943, when it was absorbed into a larger foundation that continues to provide scholarships to this day. Few recipients know the origins of their funding or the story of the woman who may have inspired it. Thomas Harper's legal papers, donated to the University of Georgia Law School after his death in 1892, contain drafts of legislation he proposed during Reconstruction, aimed at criminalizing specific forms of mistreatment of formerly enslaved persons. One draft bill, never introduced to the legislature, included unusually detailed language prohibiting the confinement of any person in spaces unsuited for human habitation, including attics, cellars, or other such chambers lacking proper ventilation, illumination, or means of egress. Marginalia in Harper's handwriting questions whether such specificity would be politically viable, eventually concluding, too revealing of specific case, revised to more general terms. The most compelling evidence suggesting Clara Mayfield's fate emerged in 1985, when an architectural preservationist examining the oak behind the former Forsyth property noticed unusual scarring on several branches that extended toward the house. Tree ring analysis indicated that significant damage had occurred to these branches around 1854, consistent with the sudden application of weight, followed by breaking. Whether this represented evidence of Clara's escape attempt or was simply storm damage cannot be determined, though the preservationist noted in his report that the pattern was more consistent with human intervention than natural causes. In 2003, ground-penetrating radar used during an archaeological survey of the property revealed a small anomaly beneath what would have been the rear garden in the 1850s. City regulations prohibited excavation without evidence of historical significance, and the current property owners declined to pursue further investigation. The anomaly remains unexplored, another unanswered question in Clara's story. A journal article published in 2008 in the American Historical Review examined the case as an example of how the experiences of enslaved women often exist in historical blind spots, present in fragments, hints, and whispers, but rarely documented with the thoroughness afforded to other historical subjects. The author argues that the very elusiveness of Clara Mayfield's story illustrates the broader erasure of enslaved women's experiences from historical records, noting, "The absence of definitive evidence is itself evidence of a different kind, evidence of systematic silencing. That silencing extends to the present day." When researchers attempt to access what remains of the Forsyth family papers in various archives, they often encounter unusual restrictions or are told materials are unavailable due to conservation concerns. Whether this represents institutional caution or the lingering influence of powerful Southern families remains a matter of speculation among historians. Some have suggested that certain aspects of Clara's story hit too close to uncomfortable truths about the antebellum South that some would prefer to keep buried. In 2011, a historical novelist researching Clara's story reported a strange experience while visiting the site of the former Forsyth home. Standing beneath the replacement magnolia tree at dusk, she claimed to hear what sounded like singing coming from above, a woman's voice, clear but distant, singing something that resembled a hymn, but with altered words. When she looked up, she saw what appeared to be a figure in the third-floor window of the adjacent building. Upon investigation, she discovered that building had no third floor, having been reduced in height during renovation in the 1920s. The novelist abandoned her project shortly afterward, citing discomfort with the material in correspondence with her publisher. The Savannah Tourism Board makes no mention of Clara Mayfield in its official historical materials. Ghost tour companies, however, frequently include some version of her story in their nighttime excursions through the historic district. Though details vary dramatically between tellings, some present her as a conventional ghost haunting the site of her suffering. Others portray her as a symbol of resistance whose spirit remained to bear witness to the crimes committed against her. A few even suggest that she never existed at all, that she is a composite figure representing the countless unnamed enslaved women who suffered similar fates in Savannah's grand homes. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these interpretations. Clara Mayfield, whether that was her real name or one assigned to her, may have been one woman who endured specific horrors in a specific attic room. Or she may represent many women whose stories have been lost to history, preserved only in fragments of documents, oral traditions, and the persistent discomfort that certain historic properties evoke in sensitive visitors. Either way, her story serves as a reminder of what lies beneath the elegant facade of Savannah's history, the suffering that made possible the beauty that tourists come to admire. In 2017, during the removal of the magnolia tree that had stood on the former Forsyth property for over a century, workers discovered a small metal object embedded deep within the trunk. Initial excitement that it might be Sarah Harper's cameo brooch faded when closer examination revealed it to be a simple iron key of 19th century manufacture. Metallurgical analysis indicated it had been placed in the crotch of the young tree sometime around 1860, becoming enveloped as the tree grew. Whether this key once opened the attic door in the Forsyth home, and who might have placed it there, remains yet another unanswered question in Clara's story. That same year, an elderly woman visited the Savannah Historical Society, claiming to be a descendant of someone who had known Clara Mayfield. She brought with her a folded piece of paper that she said had been preserved in her family for generations. On it was written a single line in faded ink: "She made it to Philadelphia." When asked who had written this note, or how they knew this information, the woman said only that it had been passed down with instructions that it should eventually be returned to Savannah, when it was safe to tell the truth. Despite efforts by archivists to obtain more information, the woman left without providing her name. The note was added to the collection, but disappeared during a catalogue update the following year. Modern forensic techniques applied to photographs of the bloodstains described in Sarah's diary suggest that what she interpreted as evidence of violence might actually have been evidence of childbirth. Several historians have proposed that Clara may have been pregnant when she escaped or was removed from the attic, though no records exist of any child associated with her. If such a child existed, its fate is yet another mystery surrounding this case, The Harper family papers, maintained by descendants living in Massachusetts, contain a letter written by Sarah in 1879, shortly before her death. Addressed to her daughter, it contains what may be the closest thing to a conclusion in Clara Mayfield's story. I have carried this knowledge like a stone in my heart for 25 years. I tell you now not to burden you, but so that someone will remember when I am gone. I believe she escaped that night. I believe she lived. In my final dream of her, she is standing beneath a northern sky, face turned upward, breathing air that belongs to no master. Whether this is truth or merely the wish my mind has shaped into memory, I cannot say, but I choose to believe it. We must believe that some escape is possible, even from the darkest places we create for one another. Whether Clara Mayfield found that escape, whether she lived or died, reached freedom or found another end, history does not conclusively tell us. Her story exists now primarily as a whisper that passes between those willing to look beyond Savannah's polished exterior to the painful truths beneath. When you walk those historic streets, past houses where enslaved people once lived and worked and suffered, listen carefully. Some say you can still hear singing from an attic window, not a lament, but a hymn transformed into something else. A declaration that even in the most confining darkness, the human spirit seeks light, seeks freedom, seeks escape. A declaration that some stories, no matter how thoroughly power attempts to erase them, refuse to remain silent. The Savannah Municipal Archives still contain a single entry in the property ledger for the Forsyth home, dated July 1854. It notes only, "One female servant departed without leave." No further details are provided. No search was recorded. No advertisements for her capture appear in local newspapers from that period. It is as if, having left that attic room, whether through the window, the door, or some other means, Clara Mayfield stepped out of documented history and into something else. Legend, memory, or perhaps a life finally her own, unrecorded by those who had previously claimed ownership of even her name. And perhaps that absence from the record is its own kind of victory, the final escape from a system that sought to document, categorize, and control every aspect of her existence. In disappearing from the archives, she may have achieved what she sought that night in the attic, a life beyond the reach of those who had imprisoned her, a story that belonged to her alone. Today, visitors to Savannah who hear Clara's story often look up at the attic windows of historic homes with new awareness of who might once have been confined behind them. Some report feeling watched as they pass certain properties. Others claim to hear singing on quiet nights, carried on the breeze that moves through the Spanish moss. Tour guides point out that such experiences are simply the power of suggestion at work, that once you know a story, you begin to find evidence for it everywhere. But perhaps those sensations represent something else, not Clara's ghost, but her legacy. The discomfort visitors feel may be recognition of truths long suppressed about the foundations on which Savannah's beauty was built. The feeling of being watched may be the weight of history's gaze, demanding acknowledgement of what happened in those elegant homes, and the singing, real or imagined, may be the voice of memory refusing to be silenced. In the end, what remains of Clara Mayfield is not a body, not a grave, not even a definitive record of her existence. What remains is a story that continues to be told, despite all attempts to erase it. A story that reminds us how the most beautiful facades can conceal the darkest truths, and how even in the most confining circumstances, the human spirit seeks freedom. Through a window, through flight, through transformation, or simply through being remembered by those who come after. As you leave this narrative behind and continue with your day, you may find yourself thinking of Clara, wondering about her fate, imagining what became of her after that night in the attic, In doing so, you participate in the one form of justice history has afforded her, the refusal to let her story disappear entirely. While we may never know with certainty what happened to the most beautiful slave who was imprisoned in the attic, we can ensure that the question itself, and the truths it reveals about our past, continues to echo through time, demanding to be heard.